The other big gig that Ed and I did was Count Basie and Samy Davis Jr. in Detroit, an album called My Shining Hour. I've got that as a copy of the Cutting Master also in my file. Funny story about that, Basie was on the road playing the Michigan State Fair, and Samy was on the road with his show called Golden Boy. And they both ended up in Detroit, probably by accident, but anyway, MGM put the deal together to do a week, and they rented this old vaudeville movie theater that was showing a double feature when the first one was Godzilla versus the Thing, and the second one was the Carpetbaggers. And Val Valentin, who was the MGM guy, got a hold of the projectionist, and he edited an entire reel out of the Carpetbaggers. And that let us get on stage about midnight rather than about 1 o'clock. And so what happened is they'd fly the screen, they pull the drapes aside, or the curtains, and they had these big Altec A4s, and the horns, speakers, and they'd roll them out of the way. And about 1 o'clock, the band would start trickling in, and they had about an hour to, get their chops together and have a drink or whatever they wanted to do. And then they would play all night. Now, Val would fly in on the evening of and do the gig. He was mixing. Ed and I were, well, Ed was helping Val, but I was the techie, so I was taking care of whatever. And at the end of the day, which was like 7 in the morning, Val would get on a plane with the Masters and go back to New York and listen to him in his room. This was live to 3, by the way, half-inch, with an Ampex 300 3-track. And I think we had a Scully 3-track in there also, if I remember. And he would take a listen and figure out if there was anything technically that needed to be changed. And he would also do a critique on the production values and the playing and, all the stuff that you have to do if you're the producer. And he would get on a plane about 6 o'clock that same night and fly back to Detroit and do it all over again. And he did this for a week. So he was getting, just except on the airplane, he was getting 0 sleep. And he was in his late 40s, early 50s, I think, at that point. But anyway, he was one heck of an energetic guy. Another one that should have lived long enough to be a very old man, but he's not with us anymore. Luis P. Valentin. Everybody called him Val. He was from Puerto Rico. I'm not sure what his musical background is, but he had very good ears, and he had worked for Radio Recorders, which was a studio in L.A. after the war that did all kinds of record gigs and whatnot. And he was a stand-up. This is rotary faders, by the way, so he's standing up for the entire session, twiddling knobs. That's the way he worked. Sliders, we couldn't afford sliders, and they weren't any good ones on the market anyway at that point. So it was all rotary 100K Allen Bradley pots, continuously variable. I still have some in the basement. Well, anyway, Quincy Jones was the arranger on all but 2 of the charts. And so all of his stuff, they would do several takes, some of which, there were some little musical hiccups they wanted to fix. And the other 2 charts were by some other arranger who had major problems. And I remember we spent all of one session on one tune, and I don't think they ever did get a good take of it until the next day. And really funny story, which I'm sure we can't tell on the air, but they finally got a take, or a good take, on one of these trouble tunes. And Samy comes bouncing into the control room, and he hops up on the console and practically collapsed the legs. And he looks around at everybody and he goes, "How about that, a one-eyed Jewish nigger what sings?" Because he had converted to Judaism. He married Meg Britt, who was, a white actress. He was funny as can be. But I tell you, the experience of my lifetime was walking out on that stage and just walking around and listening to these cats warming up. That was hair-raising. really and truly.
How many mics on that session?
Oh, I think the console had 24 in, and I think we used most of them.
Was everything close mic then?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was the, but you know, they're micing the reeds on the woodwinds and the saxes and whatnot, and they've got. I think they were using RCA ribbons on the horns because they don't have that big hot high end that some of the condensers did. And Val brought a whole suitcase full of MGM's microphones. And it was a vacuum tube console with our 12-channel mic preamps in it. We built the mic pre's in 12 because that's what would fit in the 19-inch or 17-inch chassis. And a pair of 3-track half-inch machines, one Ampex, one Scully, and that whole thing was again plus 30 into a 100K load, and the VU meters on the console were after the tape machines. So there were no meters in the signal path before it got to the tape. And at that point, VU meters were pretty good distortion generators. And that was before buffering. I mean, vacuum tube meter buffers was something I never really got into. And when the ICs became available, you didn't need much of an IC to drive a meter, but that was the way we dealt with that. And so it was real simple. And the console used active summing with feedback back to the sum junction, feedback wrapped around a half of a 12AX7. I was way into op amps at that point, vacuum tube. I cut my teeth from my first real gig doing op amp breadboarding for some guys at an organization I still can't talk about, but anyway. So I was way into op amps and feedback, and we had some butt-kicking electrical performance on those things. It was really quite amazing. Back then, with a plus 30 clip point on the mic pre's, and the next thing after the mic pre was a 100K pot. And then after that was a build-out resistor and a left center right switch, because this was 3-track back then. Or 1-2-3 switch, I guess it was. And there were no pan pots on the board. There was no EQ. No limiting. All of that was done in post, whatever Val decided to do. And the one thing that really bothers me about that recording is there was a guy named Howard Holzer who had invented a box that was basically a bunch of all-pass filters, and what it did is it took a 2-channel audio signal and it mushed up the phase to the point where it would make a nice mono. And back then, LPs were being simultaneously released in mono and stereo. And so this was his concession to how do you not have to make 2 different mixes. Well, the right way to do it is you make 2 different mixes. But what happens is that you play it back and you just get this big circular pattern on the scope, and you can't tell where anything is. There is no center image at all in that recording of any significance, which is a real shame. And that came and went rather fast. It was just a bad idea. But anyway.
You mentioned there were various takes, and there were a few little things they wanted to do to fix it musically. Was it compiled together out of good takes, or did they actually do it again until they got a good performance?
They almost certainly spliced. I don't know because I wasn't involved in the post-processing of it at all, but if you listen closely on that Basie Davis recording, you can pretty much tell there was some splicing going on in there. The reverb tail would suddenly change a little bit or whatever. They had a stereo EMT, and I think that was smothering some of it because the room was pretty dead. It was amazing. It was a vaudeville house, and they were inherently dead because back then they didn't have PA systems. They hadn't invented PA when this place was built. And it was right in the middle of downtown Detroit where several years later they had the riot. And I'm pretty sure that theater is long gone. It was called the Riviera. Great big barn, but anyway, sure did work.